I didn't know.
Because this is a very big topic.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
Gosh. I felt like this was all such a rearview mirror.
Good evening.
Evening.
Thank you for that.
You're
Thank you for being here tonight. We want to particularly welcome all the grad students from Georgia Tech. Thanks for coming to learn a little bit about what we do here at Skidaway Institute. We look forward to telling you more about that tomorrow. Tonight, we're going to be having a presentation from Dr. Cliff Buck, but before I introduce him, a word from our sponsor. So Skidaway Institute puts on these presentations to reach out to the public, to extend our research and our scientific interests to the public. And so I would just like to offer up to you that we do have a friends group that you can join. We have newsletters up here, a sign-up sheet if you're interested in being added to our mailing list. And of course, you can join our friends group. There are envelopes in the newsletters, but whether you join our friends group or not, we would like to be able to let you know about activities that are going here on campus. And so if you are not on our mailing list now, please sign up before you leave tonight, and so that we can get you added. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Cliff Buck. He got a bachelor's in Earth and Environmental Science in 2001 from Lehigh University. He got his PhD in oceanography from Florida State University in 2008. Then joined us here at Skidaway Institute in 2013 as an assistant professor and was promoted to associate professor in 2019. And he's going to be talking to us about some ocean chemistry that's closely related to some of the things you like to do. Cliff, take it away.
Thanks, Clark. Yeah, that's well put. And there's a lot of biologists in the room, I guess. And so my apologies really early on because biology is not my jam. So I might gloss over some things that you find incredibly important. Just bear with me, and I appreciate your patience on that. So yeah, as Clark indicated, I'm going to talk tonight about this idea of ocean fertilization, specifically how iron interacts with the carbon cycle. I'm going to present some evidence from natural systems and natural phenomenon that show us that ocean fertilization is occurring essentially all the time. And then talk a little bit about a series of experiments that happened in the late 90s and early 2000s where researchers went out and tried to kind of create ocean and fertilization experiments to see what the responses were when iron was added to natural systems. I was motivated to kind of talk on this subject, partially because I'm just really interested in it, but also because it seems to always come up, as we continue to try to grapple with the impacts of climate change and rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This idea that we can go out and seed the oceans artificially with iron to spur primary production and suck up CO2 as this means of mitigating our fossil fuel combustion practices. It just seems to keep coming up every couple of years or so and resurfacing. And so I was kind of motivated by that to dig back into the literature to see kind of what was learned and what is that even feasible? Is that realistic at all? And spoiler alert, it's not. But we'll get there. So, all right, that was already longer preamble than I had intended, so I'll try to get going here. Again, so I'm a trace element chemical oceanographer, which means I'm interested in elements that are present in the water column at vanishingly small concentrations. The kind of the superstar in this is iron, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But my research focus has really drawn me to kind of the interface between the atmosphere and the ocean. I'm interested in the processes that move material from the continents out into the open ocean. And that's kind of shown here with these satellite photos of these big dust plumes. Sorry for the viewers at home. Hopefully you can catch me pointing at things with this stick. But so this is a big dust plume coming off of North Africa and being carried across the North Atlantic. Likewise, here's kind of Asia and dust being transported across Japan out to the North Pacific. And it turns out that this is a really major process that links the continents with the oceans. And that's me just being on a ship, being silly. So this all kind of goes back to what became known as the iron hypothesis, and this was rooted in the research of Dr. John Martin. He also was working with other scientists to try and develop some of these ideas, but he's certainly given the largest amount of credit for coming up with this idea. And the fundamental concept here is that some parts of the ocean, the primary production, that is how much biomass can be created by marine algae, for example, is limited by the availability of iron to those organisms. Now, scientists have long suspected that a scarcity of iron left areas of the ocean less productive than they might be otherwise. And this goes back even into the 19th century. There was observations from the Southern Ocean where scientists, though they couldn't measure it, they speculated that it was this lack of iron causing basically an underutilization of other nutrients. But they couldn't really, like I said, they couldn't really examine this because measuring and collecting samples for iron in the ocean is extraordinarily difficult, primarily because it's there in such small quantities, such small concentrations, but you're generally on a steel ship, which is constantly trying to contaminate your samples. So it took many decades of kind of innovation to create clean sampling techniques, which allowed us to capture water without messing it up. Though I tell my students the number one thing to remember is do not stick your finger into the sample. That tends to eliminate most of the problems. And on top of that, the analyses are quite difficult as well. So nonetheless, the idea caught on, and it was put forth, again, most clearly by John Martin in the context of the ancient Southern Ocean. So he led a lot of this work and published in 1990 the iron hypothesis of CO2 change. And basically what he did was he had looked back at an ice core record and found that as we go back in time, so on the top x-axis here, we're going back to about 160,000 years ago, and we can see, and back then they didn't have all the nice colorful plotting software we have now, but basically there's a trace here of CO2, and there's periods when it's low, and there's periods when it's high. And there seems to be an inverse relationship between the concentration of CO2 and the availability of iron, or the presence of iron. So when iron is high, CO2 is low, and vice versa. When CO2 is high, iron is low. And so that spurred him to come up with this idea of the iron hypothesis, which really rests on two key criteria. The first being that iron produces phytoplankton blooms when added to certain areas of the ocean. And the second one is that the resulting biomass that's created when this phytoplankton bloom, that sinks out of the upper ocean and is taken down to the deep sea, and thus removes that carbon from the system. Okay, so it creates this kind of almost feedback mechanism, right? So the more iron that comes in, because of the, well, I'll get to this part more in a second, but basically, as iron increases, more CO2, more carbon is removed from the system. And so this idea spurred decades of research, which really continues to this day. So just as a quick aside, we always say that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So this is me just kind of showing how close to the giants I really am. So here's John Martin on the deck of a ship in 1977. The really interesting things about John Martin is so on top of being brilliant, he was stricken with polio when he was at Colby College as an undergraduate, which totally changed his life trajectory. He had intended to join the military, and he was a star of the football team and all this. And so he had to think of a plan B, and his plan B turned out to be study biology. And then he became this really influential scientist. So this is him with essentially a collection of his posse, a bunch of his scientists that he worked with, including this gentleman right here is Ken Bruland, who was a professor at UC Santa Cruz for about 30 years and really pushed the science of trace element chemistry forward. Well, Ken, he found himself a graduate student named Bill Landing, here pictured in 2006, who went on to be a professor at Florida State University. Again, really made a lot of important innovations in the study of trace elements. Is a major player in the GeoTraces program, which is this big international collaboration that if you're interested in, it's a big part of my research program, but if you're interested in learning about it more, next month's presentation by my colleague Dan Onimus will focus on the GeoTraces program. But so anyway, Bill, I don't know if he regrets it or not, but he recruited a graduate student in 2001, myself, and we worked together, and he continues to be a mentor and research collaborator, even though he claims to have retired. And then now we also have the next generation. That's my graduate student, Charlotte Coleman, who I don't know where she is. Hopefully she's watching online, or because there'll be a test in the morning. No, I kid. But anyway, so really, we are so close, just a hop, skip, and a jump from the true innovators in this field. Anyway, so back to what we're here to talk about. So like I said at the kind of the preamble, I'm going to discuss both natural processes and intentional efforts that were made to fertilize the ocean. But I really need to emphasize this point. The experiments that happened as part of this program in the late 1990s was never intended to test the efficacy of ocean iron fertilization as a climate change mitigation strategy. It really was to test to see if this worked, to see if we really understood the system enough to recognize that the availability of iron really was controlling the phytoplankton production in some areas of the ocean. So it's important to keep in the back of your mind. All right, so the why, and I mean, I appreciate you all being here, and I imagine because you are here, you are relatively engaged in the scientific literature, or at least the knowledge, and so I'll kind of treat this the way I do with my classes at UGA. In this universe, climate change is real, okay? And so one of the things that I think about a lot is trying to understand not only why climate change is happening, but how it's impacting various systems. But one of the things that we are left to struggle with is if in this world where carbon dioxide seems to be just relentlessly climbing because of our activities, what can we do to mitigate that? And that's where this idea of geoengineering comes in. And geoengineering it's really just a deliberate manipulation of the Earth system to counteract climate change. And there's a bunch of different strategies that are out there, and I'm not going to get into the other ones because we'll never finish. But one of them is this idea of ocean iron fertilization. So this figure kind of shows our current situation as it pertains to modern climate change. And so again, we have rising global mean temperature. So that's land and sea temperature together, plotted against the rise in carbon dioxide, right? And these are some model projection, kind of showing how this might continue on if we continue on, depending on what kind of trajectory we take in terms of future emissions. Now, carbon dioxide is one of the major players here, but there's other greenhouse gases too, methane, nitrous oxide, for example. There's other factors that impact our climate as well. And the way they do that is these gases change the planet's radiative balance. And so when they're emitted into the atmosphere because of the nature of their molecules, which we won't get into, they result in more energy being retained by the Earth system than is given off, okay? And the effects are clearly shown in a variety of different indicators around the planet, most notably melting ice sheets like in Greenland and Antarctica. We have loss of sea ice. The amount of Arctic sea ice is shrinking. It's getting thinner. It's getting younger. And this is indicative of the warming in the Arctic that's going on. We have sea level rise, which we were talking about before the beginning of this presentation, which is accelerating around the world. And we also have a rise in ocean heat content. At least 90% of the added heat that's been trapped by all these greenhouse gases is ending up in the ocean, right? And that's going to have serious effects on everything from physical current circulation to the organisms that live in the ocean. So, excuse me. So since the 1950s, scientists have been making regular high-quality measurements of atmospheric CO2. Okay, the figure on the left actually merges these measurements. So these are measurements of atmospheric CO2, and they've been merged with a record from an ice core where they're using trapped air bubbles from the past to get a glimpse of the atmospheric composition at that time. And so we see kind of this slow rise as kind of industrial activity starts cranking up, and then sure enough, we get into the kind of the second half of the 20th century, and it starts skyrocketing, right? This is pretty, this is confirmed and well known. One of the things to kind of take away with this, and I realize for those in the back, maybe these numbers are quite small. The pre-industrial CO2 concentration was about 280 parts per million, okay? And today we're up to about 420 parts per million. Okay, so we've increased the atmospheric concentration of CO2 tremendously, and particularly in the last 60 or so years. Okay, this figure on the right comes from the International Panel on Climate Change, and what it's trying to show is kind of the relative impacts of different factors on the radiative balance of the Earth. The units here are radiative forcing, which is a unit of watts per square meter. That's not really important. What I kind of want you to take away from this is they've combed through the literature and looked at and tried to determine how much all of the anthropogenic activities, all the different things that we're doing, how they are impacting the Earth's climate. And then they've broken that down into various subcategories. But the one that really stands out is that carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, can essentially explain all of it, right? And so the conclusion that the IPCC comes to is that our activities, our releasing of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, is responsible for all of the warming that we've been experiencing since the pre-industrial. So clearly, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a significant problem as we move forward and as a society as we try to address the issue of climate change. That's all well and good. I like to try to put things in a little bit of a human perspective. So here's my grandma, okay? And she's 98 years old. And so since she was born, the concentration in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide has gone up 40%, right? Okay? And to me, that's just incredibly remarkable. You know, in one person's, admittedly, quite long lifespan, we've had this we've altered the chemistry of our atmosphere so tremendously. She was a sprightly 94, though, in this photo. So, so we need to talk a little bit about the carbon cycle, just to kind of set the stage here. The carbon cycle is huge. It's complex. There's even a fast cycle and a slow cycle. For our purposes tonight, though, we need to just focus on a few parts of it. Carbon is held in various reservoirs throughout the Earth system. When carbon moves from one reservoir to another, we term this a flux. And this flux can happen naturally, like when a tree absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or when a volcano erupts and pushes a bunch of CO2 up into the air. But they can also happen from human activity, like when we dig up fossil fuels and set them on fire. So this chart, and again, I realize it's going to be tough to see, but and I'm going to kind of work through the important bits. But what I want you to kind of to realize is that the units in this are in petagrams of carbon, okay? And a petagram is 10 to the 15 grams. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, because it's a number that you can't, it's very difficult to get your mind around. A billion is 10 to the 9th. All right. I wanted to try to figure out some way to put these in some frame of reference that it's easier to understand. So I asked myself, okay, if I had a petagram of blue whales, how many blue whales would I have? Well, the answer is 7.4 million. So that didn't really help, because I don't know what 7.4 million blue whales might look like. But I did find, and frankly, if this isn't true, I don't care, because it's great, but that one petagram is 1,000 times all of the carbon in all of the ants on the planet. And this very great website said there was 20 quadrillion ants. So I don't need to check that. I will go with that. So with that in mind, realize that the ocean holds 40,000 petagrams of carbon. The atmosphere, on the other hand, holds about 600 petagrams. So by far, the most carbon on the planet is in the ocean, okay? The amount of each of these reservoirs is increasing as human activity moves carbon from one reservoir to the other. And primarily, this is us taking carbon from fossil fuel reserves. Cumulatively, we've taken 365 petagrams out of the Earth's crust and put it into the atmosphere. Now, some of it gets absorbed by kind of biological activity, and some of it ends up in the ocean, okay? And that's because CO2 dissolves in seawater. And thankfully it does, because it's kind of bailing us out to a certain extent. We don't have to grapple with the full extent of all of the carbon we've moved out of the ground into the air, because some of it's going to the ocean and it's not changing our climate as significantly as it might. Of course, the other side of that little relationship, that deal we've made with the ocean, is that CO2 causes ocean acidification, which is its own problem. And I've talked at that, I've spoken on that topic in this forum before, and it's on YouTube. So if you want to check out that presentation as well, I encourage you to do so. But outside of human activity, the cycle of carbon remains relatively in balance. But there were periods in the past that experienced large-scale disruptions which impacted climate. For example, there were long periods of volcanic activity that increased the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and the climate changed as a result. Another example includes algae in the ocean and dust. Okay, and so the planet is subject to long, regular cycles that impact its climate, and they kind of move the planet between warm periods and cold periods. They're slow, and they're driven by small changes in the path of the Earth's orbit and little variations in the wobble as the Earth rotates. These are called Milankovitch cycles, and they operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years to about 100,000 years. But other influences can act as feedbacks to the primary forcing from these changes due to the Milankovitch cycles. And scientists, we use ice cores to provide a record of conditions that existed when ice was formed. And so I kind of talked about this already, but one of the most widely used ice core records comes from a research station in the central Antarctic called Vostok Station. And so this is one of the more famous kind of long records of paleoclimate. And we can use the physical and chemical indicators recorded in the ice to make observations about past climate conditions. The chart on the left here shows a record going back about 40,000 years. The top pane shows the flux of dust that's recorded in the ice record, right? And then again, we have a record from the bubbles that are trapped in the ice. They can do chemical analyses to get the atmospheric CO2 concentration when that ice was laid down. And again, I want you to just note this inverse relationship. When dust is high, CO2 is low. The other thing to kind of note is that here's 280 parts per million going down, right? And so remember, 280 parts per million was that concentration that we refer to, or we think of as the pre-industrial atmospheric CO2 concentration. So whatever was happening here when this dust was high and sucking up all this CO2 was really changing the atmosphere drastically. And this goes back even further in time. So here we're back out to about 160,000 years. And this is a little busy, but what I want you to take from it is this top pane here. This is that CO2 record again, right? And so here we are in the present going back in time, okay? And these orange shaded sections are when CO2 is low, and they correspond with periods of extra dustiness, okay? Now there's a little extra information on this graph as well. This black line here, this black trace, is the iron flux deduced from the dust, okay? And we can see that it follows that same pattern because dust is a primary source of iron. The other two lines are this red line and a green line. Apologies if anyone is colorblind. I didn't make the figure. I would never do red and green on the same figure. But that follows the availability of iron as well. And these two indicators are proxies for biological activity. And again, to the biologists, I have no answers to follow-up questions. So again, what we see is that we have in these longer records, we've got this relationship between dustiness, and it's inversely related with CO2, and it seems to be contributing iron, and that seems to be creating primary production. All right, let's move back into the modern time. Okay, so dust transport in the modern world is a global process that acts as a conduit for material to move from land to the open ocean. This animation comes from NASA, and it's a model simulation from basically 2006. Dust is shown in red here, okay? And so what I just wanted you to kind of grasp the magnitude of what we're talking about here. So again, here's probably the poster child for dust production is the kind of the Saharan region of North Africa, right? And you can see this dust makes it all the way across into the Gulf of Mexico. My very first research cruise in 2001 was to collect the dust from the Sahara in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, it also brings dust over into the Amazon, where it provides important nutrients there as well. But again, other areas that are important dust production areas, the Arabian Peninsula, Australia, which we will talk about in a few minutes, as well as Central Asia sends dust out over the North Pacific. Okay. So again, the North Atlantic is the most impacted by dust deposition, but other areas can see high rates of deposition as well. That's what this is kind of a compilation of model results. And so the really warm colors here are areas where we might have 10, 20, 50 grams per square meter per year of dust entering the ocean, okay? And even in the North Pacific, you might be on the range of 2 to 5 grams per square meter per year. Note that much of the southern hemisphere experiences little dust input, basically due to there not being many source regions there. Oops, I knew I was going to do that at some point. All right, apologies. All right, and so this little schematic that I borrowed from a colleague at Cornell just kind of gives you an idea of just some of the different processes we're thinking about here. So again, source regions are generally arid areas where you have strong winds and they can pick up this material, but also land use changes can contribute to expanding dust production zones. I mean, think about the Dust Bowl, for example. Okay. While dust is in the air, it can have direct climate impacts because dust in the atmosphere acts to absorb and scatter incoming solar radiation, and that has impacts on climate. Where I'm most interested is how dust impacts ocean biogeochemistry when it either deposits directly onto the ocean or it can be incorporated into precipitation and brought down by a raindrop, for example. But dust is not the only conduit of material from the land to the sea. Biomass burning is also a major contributor. Okay, and these can include fires that maybe are set intentionally to clear farmland for cattle to graze, something like that, or wildfire. And so this can include material that comes directly from the plants themselves as they burn, right? But it can also include dust and soil that's lifted up through the convective processes. I mean, you think about you hear about like firenadoes and the kind of the weather systems that develop in these really hot wildfires. Well, all that uplift and all that updraft can bring material from the surface up into the atmosphere where it can be carried along. These images are from wildfires in Australia during 2019 and 2020. And in total, during that time, over 200,000 square kilometers were burned. This material was carried to the south of Australia, as well as far out into the open ocean in the South Pacific. The researchers studying this estimate that the fires which burned for months released about 321 teragrams of carbon. So that's 10 to the 12th or 321 trillion grams. Okay, so it's a lot of carbon. So these images show the evolution and transport of biomass burning emissions from Eastern Australia during those fires. The dark colors show areas of high aerosol concentration, so that's material in the atmosphere, indicating that material from the fires is moving out over the ocean. And so basically we work our way here from December 31st through kind of the first week of January, right? And so we can see that kind of as the fires really get going right here, the material gets carried further and further afield. And what I wanted you to take away from this is if you can pick it up. So this is the west coast of Southern and South America right here. And so in a matter of about 7 or 8 days, this material made it all the way across the South Pacific to South America. Now this painting here is a model projection of where a particle, if it was emitted from kind of the center of the fire, a particle goes in the atmosphere. This meteorological model tries to predict where it might go. And so again, by about day 7 or at day 8, it might have made it all the way to South America. The shaded regions kind of indicate the percent chance of that particle having entered the ocean at some point along the way. And again, what I wanted you to kind of see from this image is there's a pretty significant chance that this material could be transported south of 60 degrees south, which is in the Southern Ocean. So as a result of all this material being carried out over the ocean and then being deposited into it, the communities of phytoplankton bloomed, as indicated by the increases in concentration of chlorophyll in the surface waters. So that's indicated by these warm colors here. And so again, here's the east coast of Australia. That material is getting blown out across the South Pacific and really was deposited predominantly in this region here, where we see this this really strong response in the chlorophyll. Now, there's some gray contours on here that might be hard to pick up, but these represent kind of the normal background amount of chlorophyll that you might expect in these waters. And so this one right here is 0.1 milligrams per cubic meter. But compare that to the bloom, which is about 4 times that. So there's this really strong biological response to the input of this material to these waters. Another paper examining the impacts of these wildfires reinforces these general findings. The left side of this figure presents aerosol optical depth, which is just a measure of kind of how much material is in the atmosphere. And we can again see transport across the South Pacific and into the Southern Ocean. Okay, and so this kind of breaks it up into 2 regions. So there's an area just right south of Australia here, which is plotted on this pane here. And then out here in the Southern Ocean, where we saw that really big response, it takes the data that they got from satellites and puts it into kind of a time series perspective. So going back to 2004, we can see we get kind of a regular ebb and a flow of material being carried out or being measured in this region up until we get to the fire period, when we're about 5 times or more higher than the normal amount of material being carried in the atmosphere there. Now, this side of the picture, again, this shows chlorophyll relative anomaly. So this is essentially the ratio to normal. So we see this huge bloom where chlorophyll concentrations are 100%, 150% higher than normal. And again, put onto a kind of a time series perspective and compare it to normal, we can see that chlorophyll A, south of Australia, doubled at least in concentration relative to normal. And out in the South Pacific, again, it went from, kind of normal might be about 0.1 milligrams per cubic meter up to more than 0.2, almost 0.25 milligrams per cubic meter. So we have shown that the introduction of aerosol material can cause phytoplankton to bloom in response. And in order to understand how that impacts the carbon cycle, we will need to introduce a combination of processes that collectively form the biological carbon pump. In short, the biological carbon pump packages carbon in the surface ocean and sends it to the deep ocean in the form of particles. But of course, it's not quite that simple. So again, the interface between the atmosphere and the ocean is a really dynamic place, right? And this is where the atmosphere and the ocean tend to exchange mass. So for example, carbon dioxide exchanges here, and depending on the conditions, may be going into or coming from the ocean into the atmosphere. Now, in some, the ocean acts as a carbon dioxide sink, and it's absorbed about 30 to 40% of the CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere. And once it enters the ocean, it joins what's called the dissolved inorganic carbon pool, which is made up of a number of different species and has its own unique chemistry that we're not going to get into. But with adequate light and nutrients, the surface ocean is characterized by an entire biological system of autotrophic organisms and the heterotrophs that eat them. Resources are so scarce in the open ocean that this material gets recycled over and over and over again. And very little of it sinks into the ocean interior. Now, any material that makes it out of the surface and into the dark interior is still subject to grazing and remineralization by marine bacteria. And so that takes any kind of organic carbon that makes it out of the surface ocean and into the ocean interior, that's going to get chewed on by all these bugs, sorry, biologists. And that turns that organic carbon into CO2 again. But it doesn't bubble up like a soda, right? It's aqueous CO2, so it stays where it is in the water column. And it'll stay there until that water mass gets back up to the surface where it might be released again into the atmosphere. So any CO2 that makes it into the ocean interior here, it's not really sequestered or locked up for really long periods of time. Depending on where this is happening, it might be decades, it might be centuries, but that eventually that CO2 will make it back up into the atmosphere. Now, if a particle is big enough, and this is the important part, if it's big enough and it sinks fast enough, then it can make it all the way down to the bottom and get buried in the sediments. And that's what really sequestration is, right? If we're really talking about trying to get carbon from the atmosphere, where we've put it, where we stuck it there because we decided to burn fossil fuels, if we want to get it back into the sediments, it's got to get through all of this. And unfortunately, the efficiency of that is not great. It's about 1%. About 1% of the carbon in the surface ocean will get packaged and make it into the sediments. So this is what primary production looks like from space, okay? The cool blue colors indicate areas of very little productivity and encompass most of the ocean's area. You may be surprised to see that the tropics are not nearly as productive as higher latitudes. All of my students in my introductory marine environment class are surprised by this because we tend to think of the tropics as being really productive, but that's one of the key differences between the oceans and land. Now, as on land, marine autotrophs rely on photosynthesis to produce energy. This chemical equation shows the primary resources needed for this process in order to build biomass. The ratio of required elements is called the Redfield ratio. And note that the opposite reaction is respiration. In most of the ocean, the photosynthetic reaction is limited by the availability of nitrogen. But other required components may be in short supply as well. Light is often a limiting factor in the high latitudes, especially where it might be dark for 3 to 4 to 6 months. But also, light can be limiting in places where there's a big phytoplankton bloom because it can shade the organisms underneath the surface where the bloom is happening. Many organisms in the ocean, like diatoms, build shells of silica and are dependent on the availability of that building block in order to be successful. However, as we noted earlier, the availability of micronutrients like iron may often be the factor limiting primary production. Now, this figure plots the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus across the ocean basins. I've noted kind of the canonical 16-to-1 ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, and kind of so basically where we transition from orange to red, that's 16-to-1, okay? And that's not to say that primary production can't happen at a lower ratio, but we might expect for phytoplankton to be extra happy when the ratio is at least 16-to-1. But I want to draw your attention to 3 areas where the major nutrients seem to be in plentiful supply. These are the waters of the subarctic gyre in the North Pacific, the equatorial Pacific, and the Southern Ocean. Now, if we compare that map of N to P ratio and chlorophyll side by side, some patterns start to emerge. In regions where nitrogen is low, we find that chlorophyll is also low. We can conclude that primary production in these regions is likely limited by the availability of nitrogen. But what about areas where nitrogen is readily available? The equatorial Pacific and the Southern Ocean show relatively limited production when considering the nutrient supply available. So you can see, so we do see some chlorophyll from space in these regions, but I mean, there seems to be a really big discrepancy between the amount of nitrogen or the amount of major nutrients available in the Southern Ocean and the amount of primary production we observe. So these regions are known as high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, or HNLCs. Primary production in these areas tends to be limited by something other than nitrogen and or phosphorus. Oftentimes, it is the availability of iron which sets the limit on primary production. These regions also tend to have a large amount of unused dissolved inorganic carbon. And this is especially striking in the Southern Ocean because of a combination of factors. In part, this excess comes from the Southern Ocean's remarkable capacity to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. CO2 is more soluble in cold water than it is in warm seawater, so we find large amounts of CO2 being absorbed in the region. This is also a windy and stormy place, and these conditions are well suited for gas to pass from the air into the ocean. Now recall that we have seen the chart on the left previously. Emissions from the Australian wildfires was carried to the south and east where material deposited on waters that had available and nitrogen and phosphorus, plenty of unused DIC, and little production. And as we discussed, the result was huge blooms of phytoplankton. Now the charts on the right show modeled estimates, modeled data of net primary production and export production. So net primary production and export production. The orange bars are from the fire season, And the blue bars represent kind of expected normal conditions. And so you may be able to pick up, there's kind of some shading within the orange bars, and you can kind of spot the difference. So that's the extra from the fertilization effects of the wildfires. Now, Tang et al., in their paper, reported that the blooms absorbed approximately 186 teragrams of carbon between October 2019 and April 2020. That's equivalent to about 95% of the 195 teragrams of carbon that the fires emitted in the first place. However, we need to note that this does not represent the amount of CO2 that was absorbed by the ocean from the atmosphere. Okay? We also don't know if this carbon made it to the deep sea, that burial term that I was talking about in relation to the biological carbon pump. So we also need to recall that other researchers had the amount of carbon absorbed to be about half of that emitted. So while it is fair to say that on a short time scale, phytoplankton may have absorbed an equivalent amount of carbon from the surface ocean as was emitted in the fires, we don't know where that carbon ultimately went. So why is iron so important? So the profile on the left shows a typical iron profile in the North Pacific Ocean. So the x-axis here shows concentration in units of nanomolar. So that's 1 nanomolar and down. And the units on the y-axis, this is kind of canonical. This is how oceanographers do it. So this is the surface. We're headed down to the bottom of the ocean. And each of these ticks is about 500 meters. So what we see is that in the surface ocean, iron is really, really scarce. Okay? And that's because of a couple of reasons. Okay? The first is because there's very little iron supplied to the surface except by dust deposition. And there's also removal processes at work. One is that iron is rapidly removed by inorganic processes, and the other is because organisms are going to take it up as fast as they possibly can when it's there. Organisms are hungry for iron because of the many metabolic roles that it plays in the biochemistry. And as iron is used in many proteins that support cell functions. But some of the big ones, it's really important for photosynthesis. It's really important for nitrogen fixation. These are fundamental metabolic processes. You may not be used to thinking in terms of nanomoles, so I'm going to take a little minute to kind of try to put that in perspective. We chemical oceanographers tend to divide the dissolved constituents of seawater into categories based on their concentration. So the chart on the right tries to illustrate that, okay? So on the far right of it, we can think of kind of the dissolved ions that make seawater salty. So these are your sodium and your chloride, calcium, magnesium. As we move down into the left, each element becomes less and less abundant. Okay? Note that the axis is a log scale. So, for example, a decrease of say, -3 to -4 represents a decrease in concentration by a factor of 10 or an order of magnitude. Now, once we get down to antimony, which everyone knew SB was antimony, right? Okay. You probably can't see, that wasn't fair. It's too small. But anyway, so by the time we get down to antimony, we're talking about our trace elements, all right? And then we kind of reset up here. And so iron is just below antimony in terms of abundance. And so we kind of break these up into our major elements, our minor elements, and then the trace elements. So if we highlight our two friends, nitrate and iron, nitrate concentrations range from less than 5 micromolar in nutrient-starved regions to up to 35 micromolar in high nutrient, low chlorophyll areas. Dissolved iron is generally less than about 1 nanomolar, but it's often much less than that, often 10 times less than that. But put that another way, again, if you're not used to thinking in chemical units, nitrogen concentrations are about 100 parts per billion of nitrogen in seawater, while iron is measured on scales of parts per trillion. So iron is an interesting element because it's one of the most common elements on the planet. So why is it so rare in the ocean? It makes up about 3.5% of average upper continental crust, but it's not anywhere in the ocean. It comes down to chemistry. Iron is found as either iron 2 or iron 3 in the environment, the latter having one fewer electron than the former. Biology tends to prefer iron 2 for use in cellular machinery, but in the modern ocean, this is problematic. In our oxygenated environment, the thermodynamically stable species is iron 3. And iron 3 is rapidly hydrated and essentially is unavailable to organisms. It's also easily scavenged onto particles, which removes iron from the surface ocean very quickly. So why does iron play such a large role in kind of biological processes? And it's because it wasn't always that way. For much of Earth's history, there was no oxygen. So our oceans, where life began, were anoxic and reducing, meaning that iron, too, was the dominant species, and it was abundant. As life evolved, iron was there to serve the range of functions we observe today. It wasn't until about 2.5 billion years ago that early cyanobacteria started producing oxygen. And this began the slow process of converting our atmosphere to its present composition and created all manner of winners and losers along the way. And we see evidence for the oxygenation of the Earth's ocean in what are known as the banded iron formations. Okay? And so these are found around the world and are all at least 1.8 billion years old. And to form, there had to be an oxygenated surface ocean overlying an anoxic deep ocean. That's required for their formation. So that gives us indications, looking back in the past, of what the ancient ocean looked like. So life's reliance on iron is a remnant of our evolutionary past and conditions on ancient Earth. So we can add iron into our Redfield ratio, and a great deal of research has gone into determining how much of iron we should add to this relationship. We can plug those estimates in and expand to get a better understanding. Because nothing is simple, the iron quota can vary greatly. And this is important if one is trying to calculate how much carbon might be turned into biomass per unit of iron added to a system, right? So varying by 2 orders of magnitude, this ratio of iron to carbon can influence how efficient iron fertilization operates. So as we move to talk more about the ocean iron fertilization experiments, I just kind of wanted to reset. I know this has been a lot. But we were left with 3 fundamental questions. What if we can trigger biology to be more productive and take up more CO2? Would more carbon be incorporated into the ocean carbon cycle? And if so, would that carbon be sequestered? The last question is important to keep in mind, and that has to be the focus. If ocean fertilization is to be a viable means of curbing atmospheric CO2, then we need to focus on returning the carbon to the crust. At current rates, humans move about 7 petagrams of carbon per year from the crust to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. Of that, about 2 petagrams are being absorbed by the ocean. But the burial rate, the rate at which carbon goes from the ocean into the sediments, really hasn't increased. All the other fluxes have kind of sped up to go along with our adding carbon to the system, but not burial. So we see excess carbon building up in the air and in the ocean. So following on the work of John Martin and others, chemical oceanographers embarked on a series of ocean iron fertilization experiments that ran from 1993 to 2005. The community had already shown that iron stress reduced primary production in bottle incubation experiments. And the next step was to see how the actual ocean responded to the addition of iron. In total, 13 research expeditions of various design by different groups and different countries were carried out. Unfortunately, John Martin passed away from cancer before the first experiment was underway and was never able to see his hypothesis confirmed. Now, I need to emphasize that none of these experiments were designed to test if ocean iron fertilization is a viable climate mitigation strategy. As you can see from the map, the experiments targeted areas that we have introduced, regions where the macronutrients are readily available, but iron is not. Now, I need to kind of spoil things again. Of the 13 experiments that were run, exactly 1 showed possible export of carbon from the surface to the deep. We will get to that one in a minute, but first I want to introduce the SOFEX experiment, which was located here, as representative of the 12 experiments that did not show enhanced carbon export. So the SOFEX experiment involved fertilizing 2 patches of Southern Ocean waters with iron. The north patch was located in waters that were low in silica, and the south patch was in waters with higher concentrations. So here's SOFEX North and SOFEX South. The shaded areas represent the concentration of silica in the waters. And this was done to address uncertainty in the role of silica availability. Now, the satellite images show the disposition of the patches on day 20 for the north patch and day 28 for the south patch, respectively. Oh, I have that backwards. Day 28 for the north, 20 for the south. Doesn't matter. We noticed that the north patch kind of becomes kind of this long, elongated filament, and that's because they did this in an area that was really dynamic with lots of currents and eddies and all sorts of things going on. Not ideal for the purposes of the experiment. But the south patch actually was pretty successful and stayed relatively cohesive throughout the study period. So we're going to focus on that one. But nonetheless, both patches show an increase in chlorophyll. That's indicated by these really warm colors. The scale is in chlorophyll in micrograms per liter, with one being the dark red. So through coordinated efforts from 3 research ships, scientists collected data for many parameters, both inside and outside of the patch. The data on the right shows the evolution of chlorophyll concentration on these panels. So that we have the north patch here and the south patch here. Open circles are outside the patch, so you can think of these as the control. The closed circles are the inside of the patch, with time from start of the experiment to when they finish. And so if we just look at the south patch, we see that chlorophyll absolutely increased as a response to the iron fertilization, okay? We see that total CO2 decreased in the surface waters in the patch relative to outside the patch. That's indicating that the biomass, the photosynthesis is taking up CO2 from the water. And we also see an increase in the concentration of particulate organic carbon, which is another proxy for biomass, right? And this is all indicative of enhanced primary production. The addition of iron spurred the community into action. But what about the flux? So Ken Bissler and his colleagues examined the rate at which particles were settling out of the surface ocean during the experiment. On the left is the flux rate measured at 50 meters in the water depth, and the right is the rate at 100 meters. Both depths are still very much within the surface ocean. Now, note that the rate of the POC flux, particulate organic carbon, has increased by a factor of 2 to 3 by the end of the experiment. Great success. So SOFEX has shown that iron fertilization can induce a bloom, and more particulate organic carbon gets down to depths below 100 meters. We don't know if it gets any deeper, but this is encouraging. There's only one problem. So these same scientists had been in this same region just 4 years previously. They used the same methods to estimate the flux of particulate material from the upper 100 meters under natural conditions. So, but in other words, they didn't do an iron addition. They were there for different reasons, measuring the same things. So this rectangle highlights the region of overlap between the two studies, okay? The y-axis shows the calculated POC flux in the same units on both sides. At the end, excuse me. And at the end of the SOFEX, the flux at 100 meters was about 12 millimole of carbon per square meter per day, okay? And it got, maybe if you include the error bars, it gets up to about 16 millimoles. Now this is within the same range as in 1998, and about half the flux estimated of January 1998. So these are samples or data from the same region, from essentially the same time of year, just 4 years previously, and the flux is actually higher in some cases. So what does that tell us? What does this mean? It means that the biomass bloom from SOFEX, when they added iron in 2002, did not result in any additional carbon export beyond what might be expected through natural processes, right? So yeah, the experiment triggered a bloom and there was export, but it might have happened had they not shown up in the first place. Some other things that I'll probably kind of get through quickly here, but the ratio of added iron to sequestered carbon was much higher than predicted. And basically this just means that there's less return on investment. You'd have to add more iron to get more carbon than they thought. And this is partly because not all of the added iron is bioavailable. Because of those kind of inorganic processes I talked about, iron is removed from the system really quickly. The sinking particles were efficiently recycled before reaching the deep ocean, so probably not sequestered. And just using this experiment as an example, you'd need to scale it up by 1 million times to send 20% of annual emissions to the deep sea. So in order to do that, you would need an order of magnitude larger than the entire Southern Ocean. So that kind of speaks to the feasibility, right? So let's quickly talk about the experiment that seemed to work. I don't want to be accused of cherry picking. So this project was called IFEX and was led by the Germans. So it's called the European Iron Fertilization Experiment, and it was done in the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean. One of the things that made this project unique was that it lasted a bit longer than its predecessors. In total, researchers added 14 metric tons of iron 2 to a patch of ocean that covered nearly 1,000 square kilometers by the end of the experiment. They worked together to monitor conditions both inside and outside of the patch, and after about a week, chlorophyll concentrations increased by about a factor of 5, down to between 100 to 150 meters. So kind of we're going with time here, and this is our increase in chlorophyll relative to outside the patch. So again, bloom happened. That's not surprising at this point. They also monitored DIC, which again, closed circles are inside the patch. So we see DIC drawdown from the production, and we see an increase in particulate organic carbon as well until that drops off again. And so what happened was there was this bloom of diatoms as a result of the iron fertilization, but eventually that population crashed and it all died. And by the time that the experiment ended, after about 37 days, they were back to kind of the initial conditions. Now this plot shows the inventory of particular organic carbon for given depth ranges, both inside and outside the patch. You can kind of think of it as the amount of POC in a square meter of water that stretches from the surface down to a given depth. And the triangles represent the inventory down to 500 meters and the circles from the surface to 3,000 meters. The latter starts to get at carbon that is reaching the deep sea and might be considered sequestered for significant periods of time. But note that inside the patch, the stock of particulate organic carbon starts to exceed that outside the patch after about 3 weeks. At its peak, the export rate was about 125 millimoles of carbon per square meter per day, or about 6 times that observed on the previous experiment, SOFEX. And this was attributed to the dominance of chain-forming diatoms like this one here that basically created big particles that sunk really fast before they could be degraded. And so they estimated, again, that the export was about 125 millimoles per square meter per day. Now, I did some calculations to try to figure out how much of the carbon was exported from the whole patch during the experiment. And it comes out to be about 1 times 10 to the 8th moles of carbon exported during the experiment. But so I try to relate that to kind of our daily carbon emissions. And so I converted that into tons of carbon per day, which is on the order of 1.2 times 10 to the 3rd. Basically, it's 4 orders of magnitude less than the amount of carbon that we put in the atmosphere every day. So again, not a lot of carbon was exported with all this effort. So they were able to induce a diatom bloom, but that was followed by a population crash. And it's the only experiment to document carbon export to the deep sea. But they conclude that biomass was likely to reach the sea floor. So as we wrap up, I want to just kind of suggest that when we think about doing these geoengineering experiments, we have the responsibility to consider unintended consequences from an ethical point of view. And the unintended consequences of the ocean largely have to do with the fact that ocean water doesn't sit still, right? And so if you seed the ocean in a certain area and use up the nutrients there, that's going to have impacts downstream, right? Because that means that the communities that live downstream that are reliant on certain standing stock of nutrients, if that's depleted, well, then that's going to upset the ecosystem function. We also have an issue of oxygen depletion beneath blooms. So when all that organic material sinks down, respiration uses oxygen. And you can think about it as kind of like the hypoxic zones off of the coast of Louisiana, right? These are happening because there's so much biological production in the surface waters that when the material sinks to the bottom and gets degraded, it sucks up all the oxygen, and this obviously has negative impacts on the organisms that live at the bottom of the water. In anoxic environments, we also have production of strong greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, and I clearly didn't remember to go back and do a subscript there, and methane. My chemistry teachers will be sad. but so these are more powerful greenhouse gas agents than CO2. And so if you think about a company who might be trying to sell carbon offsets based on ocean iron fertilization, they need to be able to account for not just potential carbon being absorbed, but what if the process they're engaged in produces other greenhouse gases as well? More dissolved inorganic carbon at depth can lead to acidification. And basically, we're unable to predict the ecological and biogeochemical response to widespread iron fertilization. None of these experiments were able to really do that on the scale that would be necessary to make any meaningful impact on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So is geoengineering viable? Sorry, there are no get-out-of-jail-free cards. Everything is painful, okay? Carbon removal is the more difficult side of the equation, in my opinion. This is where I get a little bit more on opinion. Now, I recognize society requires energy. I didn't ride a bike here. I understand that. But it does not necessarily require fossil fuels, okay? And this is something that I think that has been lost in some of the discussion. I am hopeful that technology will save us. But this is what I tell my students. Humanity really needs to stop our current geoengineering experiment before we start any new ones, okay? With that, I appreciate your patience and your time tonight, and thank you for your attention.
If we have any questions in the room for Cliff?
So I probably should know more about this, but I just haven't read up on it. But you know, you're aware of the big sargassum patch that's headed on the way to Florida. It's bigger than the United States. Is that linked to potentially any sub-Saharan dust or iron or things of that nature that they have an idea of kind of?
You know, I don't think it's well understood what triggers the blooms of that size. You know, they kind of originate much closer to Africa than the really primary deposition areas. When we learned that was coming, there was a lot of talk of trying to get a rapid grant together to try to get out there because, you know, those sargassum mats, I mean, they change their local water chemistry tremendously with all the organics that they give off, and that has a lot of impacts on iron dissolution and iron chemistry as well. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our act together, but it's a great research question, and I don't have a good answer.
Sure. I actually have two questions. The first, so I work out at Grays Reef National Marine Sanctuary, and we're very interested in understanding the full impact of climate change on our sanctuary. And we're fortunate enough to have an awesome data buoy at Grays Reef that's we're able to collect data on the surface. We're applying for grants to be able to continue getting ocean chemistry data on the ocean floor. But I'm realizing now we didn't put sediment collection in our proposals. Is that for us to get a full picture of Grays, I mean, I'm sure it's very spatially scaled differently, but just to get a full picture of the impact of climate change on Grays Reef, would it be good for us to be looking at the sediments and be able to get some idea of carbon sequestration within the sediments, not just the ocean floor, ocean water, but also the sediments?
Yeah, well, I'm contractually obligated to say yes, that sediments are very important because my director is standing right there and he's a sediment guy. But no, I mean, certainly I think, you know, as someone who engages in kind of time series research as well, like obviously the more parameters you can kind of constrain, the better picture you'll get. You know, deploying sediment traps for a week or two is, if you're going out there with your shiny new ship anyway, I think it's well worth your while. And I think you can certainly get a sense of the rates of different processes based on sediments from cores as well as fluxes that you might catch in a trap. So yeah, I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that if there's capacity just to kind of add it on, it'd be great. You know, and I'm sure there's people at Skidaway that would perhaps lend support. I don't want to speak for anyone, or who measure trace elements on marine particles routinely and things like that.
Yeah, and I guess I know you emphasize you're not a you're a biologist, but I was wondering, are there studies that combine bioengineering with, geoengineering with bioengineering and looking at species that are able to introducing species that are able to sequester carbon, or maybe there are certain species that sequester iron. Like I actually worked at SKIO as an undergrad, but and looked at Vibrio fisheye as well, and I was curious if there were more.
I can't answer necessarily about a bioengineering angle on it, but certainly there's a great deal of research trying to look broadly at different groups of organisms, and again, trying to get at that iron quota for them, because again, you know, 2 orders of magnitude in terms of iron incorporation is huge, and that's just an estimate. But so certainly some groups of organisms will have a higher or lower iron requirement, and I think maybe Natalie might even know better than me back there hiding, not answering. But no, certainly I think that's an area of active research, just not one that I'm terribly on top of.
Thank you.
Sure.
A much dumber question. You're seeding part of the ocean with iron, and as an aerospace engineer who works on airplanes all the time, I'm envisioning dropping barrels of nails out of airplanes. How do they seed the ocean with
That's a great question, and I had to, believe it or not, I cut things for time. So the way they traditionally have done it is they'll take iron 2, generally in the form of iron 2 sulfate, and basically throw it into acidified seawater and dump that behind the ship, and it gets mixed up in the wake, right, and spreads out. Other more recent kind of proposals have talked a little bit about actually seeding from airplanes and trying to be a little bit more intentional about engineering the substrate so that it's both a combination of available to the organisms, but doesn't precipitate out really quickly. Like nails would just, you know, go to the bottom, right? They're not, but I understand your point, of course. One of the things that I didn't mention was, so by international agreement in 2008, there's a ban on these types of studies. And so what you'll find is in the more recent literature, Ken Bissler, for example, one of my colleagues up at Woods Hole, you know, they're advocating for a return to doing this kind of research because there are a lot of questions, and I think, you know, with hindsight being 2020, things they would do differently with the original experiments. I don't know necessarily where I fall on the spectrum of whether, you know, we should go back to doing these kinds of things. But certainly one of the avenues of investigation would be, again, trying to optimize the seeding chemistry itself to try to be more efficient so that there was less loss. And yeah.
Yeah, but if it's banned, I guess you have to rely on natural processes like volcanoes and.
Well, and that's exactly right. So we go to hydrothermal plumes. We look at when a volcano erupts and look at the responses there. There's islands where there's natural iron addition. I mean, Hawaii, for example, and several islands in the Southern Ocean where you can actually see kind of tongues of iron enriched water just based on the ocean washing past these land masses. And so that's where a lot of the study is happening now.
Running into kind of a dead end of iron fertilization, what would be your next step? For example, you say that we should start doing new geoengineering. So what would you do next?
But see, yeah, I try to avoid any kind of political type discussions, right? But certainly, I mean, I think our large issue right now is trying to turn. We got this bathtub, right? It's got a drain, it's got a spigot, and we have the spigot going full blast, and it's filling up, you know, with CO2, right? And we got to just turn that spigot down a little bit, buy ourselves some time so that the technology can catch up. Now, I don't know if that means direct air carbon capture. I don't know if it means some other means of removing carbon dioxide and not sending it down into the geology. You know, all these things are very energy intensive, right? Because of that pesky law of thermodynamics, right? You know, we got all this energy when we combusted it, and you got to put that energy back in, basically, right? And so it's a technological challenge at this point. I mean, I'm no fool. People are used to a certain kind of lifestyle, of a certain amount of technology and energy being readily available, and that's not going to change. So I think, making decisions that kind of can help us curb our emissions to buy us time while we can kind of come up with something that can get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and back into the geology is really the only thing that we got going for us.
Okay, any other questions in the room?
I have one more, sorry.
Sure.
Do you feel like there's enough data out there? I just mentioned there's hardly any seafloor data. Do you feel like there needs, and we've got great satellite imagery, but would you push for more monitoring of the ocean floor and more samples of sediments?
Yes, National Science Foundation. I always push for more study. No, yeah. And so more recent research, not directly on ocean iron fertilization, but certainly as part of the GeoTraces program, for example, we are, as a community, exploring these different processes, and we've learned a great deal since 2008, right? But certainly there's just, we don't even know what we don't know at this point, right? And so honestly, I think without sounding kind of trite, yeah, more research is better, right?
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we don't see any online, so I think you're done.
Because my grandma wasn't watching.
Thank you all for coming to this evening at Skidway presentation, and we hope to see you next month when Dan Onimus is presenting. Do you know?
Yeah, I believe he's going to do an overview of the GeoTraces program.
Okay.
So you can learn all about why we are mapping the oceans for trace elements.
Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks so much.
And don't forget to